the crow cried once, sharp, ominous. A crack in the breathless dawn. Elias stood barefoot in the pottage smoke, her toes sunken in mud, chilled by a dying summer. Mist ghosted between the huts, like a memory too thin to hold. Everything was wet. Her hem, her hair, her hope. The thatch above sagged with rot, and the clay below sucked at her steps, as if the earth itself wished to pull her down and never let go. She stirred slowly, the wooden spoon heavier than it should have been, not from weight, but from inheritance. It was her grandmother's, then her mother's, and now hers, smoothed by fingers long since buried. She crushed the salt between her fingers with a grim reverence, stealing a pinch more than she dared. The crystals bit into her chapped skin, tiny, defiant stings, reminders that she could still feel. The hearth behind her gave no warmth, only smoke. It coiled upwards, thin and lazy, trailing into the pale sky, like the last breath of something forgotten. She didn't look at her mother. She didn't need to. The silence behind her was familiar, shaped by years of too little bread and too many mouths. Elias's mother was wrapping crusts in cloth with trembling hands, linen once meant for saints or births or burials, now wrapped around crumbs. Her lips moved around a prayer, Latin twisted by memory, vowels slurred by time. There was no one left to hear it. God had gone quiet in these parts. Outside, the wind was shifting, eastward, harsh. A cold edge whispered through the reeds and into the bones of the village. It pressed against the wattle walls, against the baby's breath, against the brittle thoughts of men who remembered better harvests and softer deaths. Across the path, a man cursed. The ox yanked forward, dragging a broken plow through unyielding clay. His hands were raw, his shoulders bowed like an ox himself. Elias's father. Once he had sung when he worked, now he did not even speak. It was 1293, the third year of failed harvests. No rain, then too much, then nothing, always too little, or too late. The manor's bailiff had come down last week, boots spotless from being carried, hands smooth from never bleeding. He counted chickens that weren't there, measured grain that hadn't grown, and left with the last of their barley. He had smiled when he took it, smiled with small white teeth, the kind of smile that made children look away, and women grip each other's arms. Elias had watched her father bite the inside of his cheek, until it bled. He had not begged, but his silence was heavier than a plea. Now the hunger wrapped around their ribs like belts pulled too tight. The baby, her youngest brother, wailed without strength. The sound was more air than cry. Her older brother, Tama, had stopped speaking altogether. He only watched the fields and chewed bark. That night, they huddled by the dying fire. A single log sputtered. The heat, if any, was ceremonial. Her mother's fingers worked quickly, stitching an old burial shroud into something vaguely tunic-shaped. The baby had no clothes, just rags and warmth borrowed from other bodies. Each stitch landed like a heartbeat, a rhythm against the silence. Thud, thread, thud, thread. Elias lay beside them on a straw pallet, Lias crawling through the mat of her hair, scratching as constant as the wind. Her limbs ached, not from labor, but from growing too long without growing stronger. Her eyes fixed on the ceiling, where rats traced the beams like spirits. Above, the church bell tolled vespers. No one moved. They had nothing to offer, not even breath. Elias did not cry, not from pride, not from numbness. Simply, there was no time, no room. Tears belonged to those who could afford pause, and in this place, even grief was rationed. In the night, the ox died. No one spoke of it in the morning. Her father buried it behind the hut, too close to the stream. The soil was shallow there. The scent would come back with the wind, but no one complained. They were too weak, too familiar with rot. 1 week later, the reeve returned, with parchment, a list of names, and a voice like iron nails on wood. "The king wants bodies," he said, "not prayers." There was a rebellion stirring in Wales or France or Scotland. No one knew, but the manor owed men, and the village owed the manor. Elias's brother, only 14, was taken that afternoon. Her mother did not scream, she simply turned away, as if Tama had been a shadow she could walk past. When night came, Elias wandered to the edge of the fields. The moon hung low, swollen and yellow as old fat. The wind pulled at her tunic, and the silence sang. She knelt in the mud where the ox had been buried. Her knees sank deep, she dug her fingers in, not to find anything, but to feel something, cold, wet, real. Something shifted in her chest, not courage, not rage, something quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that moves like a tide, not loud, but unstoppable. She would leave, not because she had a plan, not because she dreamed of castles or cities or saints, but because the mud was swallowing her, and she would rather run into the teeth of the world than disappear without sound. She looked back only once. The village was smoke and shadow, no fire, no voices, just the hush of lives unrecorded. She walked toward the woods, toward a road no one spoke of, where men vanished and rumors walked. Behind her, the wind scattered the ashes of the fire. Ahead, a torch flickered in the distant dark, and somewhere, across the valley, church bells rang for the dead, or for the brave. The wind howled like a wounded beast. Tama stood motionless in the shallows, the water biting at his legs like tiny blades. Around him, the stream chattered with ice, shards drifting by like broken glass. His fingers, purple and numb, clenched and unclenched in the silt, as if they belonged to someone else. The sun had not risen, it merely stained the horizon in a bruised red, more warning than warmth. Behind him, the mill loomed, dark, motionless, a monument to a lord who never came. Its wooden wheel, rimmed with rime, creaked with each gust, like the groan of a dying man. From the doorway, the miller's voice cracked the morning stillness. By dusk, boy, or your rations are halved. Tama didn't look back, he didn't speak. Words were for those who mattered. He thrust his hands deeper into the stream, dredging up black mud and twigs, hoping the water would move again. The stream had fed the mill once, ground wheat into flour, fed the manor, fed the men who would never know his name. But now it starved, choked by ice and time, and Tama, like the stream, had to be cleared, scraped of softness, stripped of anything that resisted. The cold had a voice. It whispered into his bones, told him to stop, to lie down, to vanish, but there was no one to take his place. By midday, the sky turned white, not bright, just blank, like parchment unmarked by God. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin threads, like pleading prayers. Tama's hut sat at the edge of the village, bowed under snow. Inside, the goat bleated, tied to the beam with fraying twine. His father didn't speak when he came in, just drank. The ale had turned sour, like everything else. The man slumped by the fire, one eye swollen from a fight the night before, or maybe just from life. Tama warmed his hands near the embers. The carving of the saint lay beneath his sleeping mat, the wood worn smooth where his thumb traced it in the night. A chipped face, a key, a secret. The chapel bell rang 3 times that evening, not for mass, for death. Old Marta had passed, the midwife with no children of her own. They buried her in the frost, the priest mumbling Latin over a grave dug shallow by boys with sticks. Tama stood among them, eyes downcast. The priest's words floated like fog, heavy with syllables no one understood. Pacetum, requiem, aeternam. The words meant nothing, but the silence afterward did. After the burial, the priest pulled Tama aside. "You've a mind," he said, "and quiet hands." Tama nodded. "I've need of both." The chapel was colder inside than out, walls slick with damp, candles flickering, like frightened eyes. Tama swept the stone floor, lit incense on feast days, polished the brass chalice until it gleamed like sunlight through tears. He learned to listen, not to words, but to spaces between them. In time, the priest let him read, not scripture, that was sacred, but lists, ledgers, names of men and grain and debts owed. Tama's world changed. Letters became ladders, pages became paths. He began to dream of parchment, of quills, of stories trapped behind stone walls, guarded by silence. Monks wrote them, he learned, monks who lived in warmth, surrounded by books, their days a rhythm of ink and prayer. Tama imagined the scratch of their pens, the gold leaf halos that bloomed in the margins. He dreamed of being one of them, not for the robes or the bread, but for the stories, for the knowing. One night, after the chapel emptied, he stayed behind. The candlelight trembled as he pulled the old carving from his sleeve. He placed it on the altar. The saint stared back with blind eyes, the key clutched tight to his chest. "What do you unlock?" Tama whispered. Outside, the snow fell again. Spring came late, the moors bloomed with heather, but the hunger remained. The Lord had gone to war, leaving behind tax and silence. Men disappeared into levees, fields went untilled, the village began to bend under invisible weight. Tama grew leaner, but inside, something hardened, not bitter, not broken, just sharp. One afternoon, he saw a raven circling above the chapel, not a swallow, not a dove, but black-feathered, proud. It landed on the bell tower, cawed once, then watched. Tama met its gaze. Something passed between them, not a message, but a memory. That summer, travelers came, cloaked in dust, whispering of cities, of heretics, of fire. One carried a book bound in red leather, marked with a symbol Tama didn't know. They stayed only a night, but they left something behind, a scrap of parchment, hidden under the chapel bench, a psalm, maybe, or a poem. Tama couldn't read it yet, but he kept it, because it was his, because someone had dropped knowledge like a seed, and Tama, barefoot, beaten, forgotten, had caught it. One night, after his father collapsed drunk beside the hearth, Tama walked to the stream. The moon hung low, veiled in cloud. He knelt in the water, not to dredge silt, but to feel it, the current, the weight, the memory of winter. He held the wooden saint to his chest. The mill creaked behind him. He whispered, "One day, I will open every door." The wind did not answer, but it listened. Morning came with fog, and in the mist, the first swallow of the year. Its wings cut the air like knives. Tama watched it, until it vanished, not into sky, but into the place where stories begin. And somewhere in the monastery, far away, a monk dipped his quill into ink, unaware that a boy with frost-bitten hands had just begun a journey no winter could stop. Rain fell in sheets as the cart creaked through the village, its wheels caked with mire. Inside lay a corpse wrapped in wool, the baker's eldest, dead of flux. No bell rang, no prayer echoed. The priest turned his eyes away. Without coin, the soul was left to wander. From her doorway, little Matilda watched, thumb in her mouth, the other hand clutching the worn hem of her mother's tunic. The scent of wet straw, boiled cabbage, and sorrow clung like mildew to every stone. In the mud-soaked heart of the village, where roofs wept and hearths barely smoked, life was not lived, it was endured. By 7, Matilda had learned the choreography of obedience. A silent cough in church, a low curtsy before the reeve. No dreams, never speak of dreams. Dreams belonged to those in towers. Peasants were the dust beneath their boots. Her father's back bowed like a sapling under storm winds. Day after day, he hauled stone to rebuild the same crumbling wall, one meant to protect the Lord's grain, not their flesh. His hands were thick with callus, his eyes thin with sleep. Matilda saw his spirit dull, with each passing dusk, until even the fire's glow no longer reached him. She once asked, in a voice too soft to echo, "Why do the Lord's pigs eat meat, when Peter only gets broth?" Her mother struck her across the mouth, not from cruelty, but terror, not from anger, but the knowledge that walls had ears and words had weight. One wrong syllable could sever a tongue, or a hand, or a child from her family. Their hovel crouched beneath a leaning beam, and a roof patched with reeds. Leeks sang lullabies of rot. Matilda's corner was draped with woven scraps, not to warm her, but to hide her from wind and watchers. She pressed her small frame into the earth, as night came, listening to the sharp yips of foxes, and the mournful wails of wolves from the tree line. The woods held stories, not ones told, but ones remembered in silence. Once, before the church bells and the taxman's ledgers, the trees whispered to the people. But now, no one listened, not aloud. Her baby sister wailed in hunger, milk had dried, bread had grown mold. Their mother rocked her, not with hope, but with rhythm, an old lullaby passed down from famine times, a chant, a hum, a plea, to something older than saints. On the eve of St. Bridget, they left out a bowl of milk at the threshold, though no one spoke of belief anymore. Ritual clung to them like ash, a habit of desperation. Faith had become survival's brittle twin, not holy, but habitual. Even Matilda knew the difference. When her tooth came loose, twisted out by a stale crust of bread, she did not cry. Instead, she crawled beneath the hearth, lifted a broken tile, and left the tooth there as an offering, not for a fairy, as the priest's book once told, but for the rat, the one she fed crumbs to in secret, her only friend in the dark. She named it Hope. Hope twitched its whiskers, its black eyes shining like coals. It did not judge her, nor strike her, nor demand silence. It simply came, each night, to listen. By candlelight, she whispered to it, of a world where bread was sweet, and fathers laughed, of ribbons, of stars that blinked without smoke, of voices that didn't hush when she entered the room. These were not prayers, they were rebellions. Hope curled beside her as thunder growled. Outside, the Lord's men rode past, hooves cutting the mud, blades catching flickers of lightning. Somewhere, a man screamed, then silence, always silence after. In the village, silence was currency. Noise brought notice, notice brought punishment. The next morning, a woman with blood in her hair was found by the well. No one spoke her name. The children were told she'd wandered, lost her way. But Matilda saw the truth in her mother's eyes, a truth too dangerous to name. The village had rules, unwritten, unbreakable. Do not speak what you see, do not cry where it can be heard, and never ever ask why. One evening, the Reeves dog tore through the yard, teeth bared. Matilda's brother stood his ground with a stick, thin, shaking, defiant. The dog lunged. Her brother was beaten for damaging the beast's ear. A dog's pain mattered more than a peasant's blood. That night, Matilda dreamed of burning the Reeves house, of flame-licking beams, of her rat running free. But she said nothing. Dreams were not safe. Instead, she traced lines in the dirt, her finger writing stories the earth would forget by dawn. She fed hope a crust, watched its tiny paws clutch it like a blessing. Her heart ached with the knowing that one day, even hope might disappear. When the Lord's men came again, it was for grain. There was none left, they took salt instead, and the only hen. Matilda watched her father drop to his knees, his face pressed into the earth, whispering words into the mud, as if it could answer. That night, the wind howled louder. Her baby sister no longer cried, only whimpered in sleep, too weak to wail. Her mother sat by the fireless hearth, lips moving with no sound. The lullaby had faded, even habit was starving. Matilda took the last scrap of bread, and crawled to her hiding place. Hope was not there. She waited, a minute, an hour, a prayer, nothing. In the stillness, the absence screamed. She curled into herself, teeth clenched against sobs, not because the rat had gone, but because the silence now belonged to her alone. No whiskers, no listening eyes, just her, and the dark. But deep within that silence, something stirred, not loud, not bright, just a flicker, like a spark caught beneath damp wood. Defiance. It lived not in words, but in watching, remembering. Matilda, small as she was, began to gather the broken bits, stories, fragments, names not aloud, songs unsung. She did not write them, she became them. A vessel of things too heavy for her age, yet carried with grace. One night, her mother found her standing at the threshold, holding a candle stub in the storm. "Why?" she whispered. Matilda did not answer. She simply placed the candle beside the empty bowl, an offering not of faith, but of memory, for hope, for the woman at the well, for the brother's bruises, for the baker's boy with no bell, a spark in the downpour. And as the wick hissed in the rain, somewhere, in the woods, a howl rose, not from hunger, but from something older, something watching, something remembering. The silence had cracked, and through it, a girl had begun to listen. The fire was long dead in the square, but its ash clung to the wind like a bitter memory. Smoke and silence, those were the two things left behind, after a public punishment. Neither could be swept away. They lingered in the thatch and the throats of those who dared speak of what they'd seen. The wooden post still stood, a crooked monument to obedience. Flies buzzed where blood had dried, and children avoided its shadow, as though it might bite them. But Edric returned, not out of curiosity, not out of defiance, but because something inside him had cracked, quietly, like a frozen branch, bending under its own weight. No one heard it, but he did. His father's cries never came, and in their absence, something colder had taken root. Edric sat in the wet grass that morning, hidden by the edge of the bakehouse, and watched as the village stirred. Boots clomped, doors creaked. The blacksmith's song resumed, though its tune faltered whenever he passed the square. The baker offered loaves, round and warm, as if to deny the coldness of yesterday. But the boy felt it all. Each moment sharpened, louder, more permanent. His father's whip marks were healing now, poorly, beneath rough linens and silence. And Edric had become his echo. He too walked quietly. He too no longer ran, and the woods began to call him, not with sound, but with memory. Every tree had been touched by his father's hands. Every root seemed to whisper a secret. Edric listened. The first time he found a snare, it was almost by accident, a loop of cord, half covered in moss, like a forgotten word, waiting to be spoken again. His fingers hovered above it. Then, gently, reverently, he reset it, as if he were rebuilding a broken altar. He didn't take, not yet. He only touched, watched, learned. The forest was different than the village. Here, no one asked questions. No one demanded papers or penance. The trees did not care that he was the poacher's son. The mud did not judge the hunger behind his eyes. And when he sat beneath the oak, the one with a hollow, like a mouth yawning toward the sky, it felt like a place older than law, older than lords. He unwrapped the cloth, the one with a crust of bread inside, and placed it gently into the hollow, not as bait, not as an offering to any god they'd taught him in church, but as remembrance, a tribute to the man who had broken the law to keep his children from breaking. That night, at the hearth, his mother's hands moved like ghosts across the fabric she sewed. Her fingers trembled, though the needle never wavered. Edric watched her more carefully than before, saw how the lines near her mouth had deepened, how her rosary now lay untouched beside her, as if faith had turned its back. He reached across the firelight, and kissed her hand. She flinched, not from fear, but from surprise, as though the gesture pulled her backward, into a time when such affection still lived in the house. Her eyes held him, not like a boy, not quite like a man, but like a branch she hoped would not break beneath its burden. In the days that followed, Edric walked deeper. The snares came more easily now, and with them, a new kind of prayer, one not spoken with lips, but with patience, with stillness, with a heartbeat that learned to match the hush of falling snow. He caught nothing at first, then a rabbit, then two. He did not boast, he did not share. He buried the bones behind the smithy, where nettles grew wild and unbothered. The meat fed his mother in small pieces, tucked into stews that pretended to be made from lentils alone. No one asked questions, not yet, but the Reeves dog had a nose for secrets. It came sniffing near the blackened post one morning, tail stiff, breath sharp. Edric watched from the trees. He stayed still until the hound's ears dropped, and it wandered away. Still, the boy knew, time was not on his side. The forest gave, but it also remembered, and so did men. One night, as frost bloomed across the windows, and the wind cried like something lost, Edric sat by the hearth, with his mother. She did not sew, she only stared at the flames, her lips moving, but no sound came. He knew what she was whispering, not prayers, names, his father's, his brother's, the one lost to fever before memory began, maybe even her own, as if trying to remind the world she was still here. Edric stood. He walked outside, bare feet against the frozen mud, and stared at the bell. It hung high in the chapel tower, rusted, frayed at the rope, silent. It had rung for births, for weddings, for war, for judgment. He wondered, would it ring for him? For a boy who followed in his father's footsteps, not out of loyalty, but because no other path was left. The rope swung gently in the breeze, frayed, waiting, and in that moment, he did not feel like a child. He felt like a lit fuse, a quiet rebellion, coiled in flesh and bone. At dawn, he returned to the forest. The trees were pale with frost, the leaves crunching beneath his step, like brittle secrets. He moved toward the hollow oak again, only this time, he did not come to give, he came to ask. He pressed both hands against the bark, and closed his eyes. If you remember him, he whispered, remember me too. A single leaf fell, slow and deliberate, landing near his feet. He took it as a sign, not of approval, but of witness. Someone, or something had heard. And in the village, the bell rope frayed a little more. A wooden pail slips from trembling fingers and crashes against the cobblestones, scattering milk like spilled light. No one helps her. The courtyard swallows the sound. Cold wind wraps around her, like an old cruel friend. Beatrix, 12 winters old, stoops without a word. The wool of her skirt darkens with frost and milk. Her knuckles bloom red as she gathers the broken pieces. Behind her the manor looms like a slumbering beast, its arched windows glowing with candlelight, its stone throat wrapped in ivy and tapestries. She's never touched. She is the kitchen girl. She is nothing. By the time the rooster raises its head, Beatrix is already at the hearth. The fire is half dead, and so is the warmth in her fingers. She breathes into her palms. The air blooms white and vanishes. A log hisses, smokes, then catches. Embers glow like the last bits of a dying constellation. She feeds it slowly, like a mother nursing a sick child. The scullery behind her is dark, damp, unkind. Her name, what she was called before this place, rarely crosses her own lips, not aloud. The cook calls her rat, and sometimes gutter snipe. He tosses bones at her when he's drunk, and he is always drunk before Mass. She learned long ago that words can wound, but silence can outlive the blade, and so her tongue grew quiet, learned the corners of her mouth where it could hide. She scrubs until her hands are raw, plucks geese until the blood stains her nails. She stirs porridge with a wooden spoon older than herself, and when the pot boils over, she does not flinch, only moves faster. The nobles in the great hall float past her like spirits, silks whispering, perfumed sleeves brushing against carved stone. Their voices are curled in Norman French, each word delicate and sharp. They sip wine warmed with cloves. They laugh at riddles. Beatrix can't hear from the kitchen, but she imagines they have no teeth. Once, she caught a glimpse of the lady of the house. She stood by the window brushing her golden hair with ivory, humming to herself. Her mirror was framed in gilt, her hands wore rings like tiny suns. That night, Beatrix scrubbed her own scalp with cold water and river mud, weeping softly so the cook wouldn't hear. She has never been taught to read. There is no ink for her, no candle, no parchment. But sometimes, when the cook burns a recipe or tosses old letters into the hearth, Beatrix steals them. She waits until the fire sleeps, then plucks the warm scraps from the ash, hides them in a crack behind the bread oven. She traces the letters with flour-dusted fingers, whispering their shapes like prayers. She does not know their meaning, but she knows they matter, and so the words come to her like rain through a leaking roof, slow, accidental, unstoppable. Once, the priest caught her staring too long at the carved Latin on the chapel walls. He called her heathen, and struck her hand. But the lines had already sunk into her bones. The language of the nobility may be locked away, but Beatrix steals it one syllable at a time. The chapel bells toll for mass, the kitchen empties. She stays behind, scrubbing soot from the stone hearth with brine and ash. As she works, she hums, a tune her mother once sang as she ground barley, back when winters were gentler. The lullaby is from the old tongue, not English, not Norman, the words of a people no longer welcome in this land. She sings softly now, each note a ghost. The scullery is still. Cold water drips from the rafters, rats skitter in the corners, but Beatrix no longer fears them. One, a small gray thing with a torn ear, visits her often. She leaves it crumbs when she can. Later, when the others sleep, Beatrix crouches in the farthest corner and removes a sliver of pewter from beneath a loose flagstone. It's all that's left of a broken spoon. The cook shattered against her back weeks ago. She could have thrown it away. Instead, she kept it. Not as a weapon, as a memory. She fingers its edges, not sharp enough to cut, but cold enough to feel. A relic of a moment, a marker of pain, a piece of herself that refused to vanish. She buries it again, carefully, as if it might grow roots. Outside, frost etches the windows like lace spun by ghosts. The wind moans down the chimney. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howls, or maybe it's just the trees. She lays her head against the stone wall, the chill of it biting her cheek. In the darkness, she does not dream of castles or lords. She dreams of words, of paper unburned, of names remembered, of fire that does not consume. A mouse scurries past her foot, carrying a single crumb. In that simple, stubborn act, Beatrix sees it again: survival, not triumph. Not glory, but the quiet insistence of life in a place that does not welcome it. And somewhere deep beneath the ash and frost, something in her waits, patient as a seed beneath the snow. Tomorrow will bring more bones, more blood, more silence. But for tonight, the fire is still warm, and the words, those strange stolen seeds, remain, waiting to bloom. A hollow clang, rolling over plague-bitten roofs, across the crooked spires of Norwich, through smoke a thick air that smelled of soot and flesh. In a room barely larger than a coffin, a woman gave birth beside a rotting window. She screamed once, then fell silent. They named him Wulfric, after a barefoot saint, whose bones had long been forgotten. But the name rang hollow. No one remembered saints anymore. Only hunger. Only the scraping of shovels burying the dead before they turned black and burst. His mother was buried before he ever learned her touch. His father followed, coughing blood into a linen soaked twice over. And Wulfric, not yet walking, not yet speaking, became no one's child. A ghost before he had a name, but the city had its own orphanage, not of care but of shadows. Norwich, in those years, was a creature stone skin, smoke breath, and a heart that beat with suffering. It coughed out its weakest, and fed them to the alleys. And in one such alley, sat an old blind beggar, no kin, no eyes. Just a voice like creaking hinges and hands that smelled of smoke and onions. He did not ask Wulfric who he was. He did not ask at all. He only shifted, made space beside him, and said, "If you're here, you're hungry." The beggar taught him silence first, how to gesture instead of speak, how to listen for footsteps that meant food or danger, how to curl your body against frost, and how to fake a cough that would make the kind-hearted toss bread from behind shutters. Wulfric's voice came slowly, gravelly, rasping, as though shaped not by a mother's lullaby, but by wind clawing through broken rafters. By the age of 10, Wulfric had one shoe, the left, and a cracked wooden bowl. But more than that, he had eyes, eyes that saw everything. He knew where the monks dumped crusts behind the priory kitchens. He knew the leper's corner, where no one dared look, and the reeve's shadow, long and cruel, falling before the lash of his cane. He knew when the drunk squires would stumble through the alleys, spoiling for someone to kick. But he watched more than threats. He watched hands, how they passed coins with a glance, how they lingered in sleeves for longer than necessary, how one merchant passed sealed letters to a black-cloaked man with a limp. Wulfric watched and remembered. Not for power, not for revenge, but because remembering was survival. Some nights, when the frost numbed even the rats, Wulfric would crawl beneath the bishop's bridge, a place even dogs avoided, and carve birds into the stone with a nail. Swans, thrushes, sparrows, not for beauty, for proof that I was here. Each carving seemed to say that I lived, even if no one saw me. He never begged at the cathedral gates. He said they were too clean there, too full of eyes that looked through you like mist. But once, in the dead of a December night, he stumbled through an open door into a chapel forgotten by prayers. The walls wept with moss, candles had long since choked on their own wicks, and on the altar sat a crow, black as tar, watching him. Wulfric didn't kneel, he didn't know how. He simply sat in the last pew, his bones shaking from the cold, and whispered, "I won't forget them, the ones no one names, the ones who bury their dead and keep walking." From that night on, something hardened in him, not bitterness, not yet, but a vow, etched deep into his marrow, that he would be a vessel for what was unseen. A voice, not for saints or kings, but for the dirt-covered souls who carried buckets, dug graves, and vanished without memory. Years passed. The beggar died during a harsh spring, ribs cracked from a squire's kick, lungs too thin to heal. Wulfric buried him under the eaves of St. Julian, where lepers wept but did not speak. He didn't cry. Instead, he sat beside the grave for hours, tracing circles in the dirt, until his fingers bled. Then he stood, walked into the wind, and vanished once more into the city. It was years before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice was different, not louder, not clearer, but heavier. Like gravel soaked in rain, like words scraped from stone. People turned when he spoke, not out of kindness, but because it felt like the earth itself was murmuring. A sound ancient and aching. No one knew where he slept, no one knew what he ate. But rumors swirled, of a boy who wandered Norwich's alleys at dusk, speaking to widows, sharing soup with lepers, listening to the dying with a silence so deep, it made them feel holy. Then, one morning, a festival day, when banners fluttered and bells rang like laughter, he climbed the steps of the old market cross, and sang, just once. No instrument, no warning, just a voice rising through soot, and fog and pigeon feathers. It was not beautiful, not in the way minstrels sang for coin. It was raw, torn, full of cold nights and empty bellies, of hands that dug graves for strangers, and feet that never stopped walking. And yet, the city stopped. Merchants lowered their weights. Dogs sat still. Children clutched their mothers. And even the bishop, peering from his arched window, blinked and forgot the sermon he was reading. When the last note fell, like a dying ember, Wulfric bowed. He didn't wait for praise. He didn't even speak. He simply stepped down, walked barefoot into the alley, and was gone. Back to the shadows, back to the stones he carved birds into, back to the silence that had always been his first language, and no one ever heard him sing again. But sometimes, years later, a widow would swear she saw him near the well at dawn, or a leper would find a carved sparrow on their door, or a child, lost in the market, would follow the echo of gravel-soft footsteps, and find their way home. Wulfric, they said, was not a saint. He was something older, something made of wind and hunger, prayer and rot, silence and song, a memory, a promise, a voice carved into the stone of a city that forgot too much. And somewhere, beneath the mossy chapel, where a crow once watched, a single candle flickers, still burning, still waiting for the next story to begin, and for the shadows to speak again. The sheep were already uneasy by dusk, their hooves thudded like war drums on the frost-bitten earth. sending tremors through the stillness. Their breath steamed into the violet air, little ghosts vanishing into the moorland fog. Winter dusk came fast here, sudden, sharp, like a blade behind the ribs. Ellsworth stood at the edge of the rise, her figure framed in the last bruised light, a lone silhouette wrapped in the wool cloak her grandmother had woven, the same grandmother who whispered lullabies of protection, and then burned in the fever with the rest of the village women. That cloak still carried the smell of ash and heather. The wind pulled at her braids like a jealous spirit, and she let it. In one hand, she held a sling, leather-worn, ready. In the other, a carved whistle, shaped like a raven's beak, her only tools, her only weapons. Against the dark, against what stalked the hills when the light fled, she was the shepherd girl, a name whispered, if at all, unrecorded, unclaimed, born behind stone and bramble and salt winds. Her world was not one of tapestries or vows sworn over goblets. It was made of mud and marrow, wool and worry, a world where wolves had names and skies bled rust at twilight. No bells marked her hours, no one counted her victories, but still, she stood. They say she spoke little, that silence was her second skin, but her silence was not empty. It was shaped, it had texture, she wove meaning into it. In the way she stacked firewood, tallest branch facing north, always. In the way she scratched charms into the bark of dying trees. In how she placed stones around her fire, not for heat, but for memory. Her mother had sung songs that no priest dared speak, songs that tasted of root and shadow, and when they came for her, robes billowing like judgment, Ellsworth was just a girl clutching an empty spindle. The songs were gone, but not their weight, so Ellsworth sang them still beneath her breath, among her sheep. In the mist, they were songs about stars, not the ones kings charted, but the ones that warned of illness, of hunger, of nights when no dawn would come, songs that remembered herbs when no healer remained, songs her mother stitched into lullabies and warnings alike. By day, Ellsworth was voice and staff and shadow to her flock. By night, she curled against stone shelves, her cloak frozen stiff, sheep pressed to her for warmth. She did not dream, not anymore. Dreams had been traded for watchfulness. She learned the language of hoof and ear, the flick of a tail, the way fear moved through a herd like a ripple through still water. She learned to read clouds, the way monks read parchment. She knew when death was near, even before the smell. Once, deep in the moor, she found a knight's gauntlet, buried beneath frost, rusted through, finger joints snapped like brittle bones. She dug it out with her hands, held it up to the light. It gleamed red like blood in the dying sun. She wore it when no one was looking, on her head like a crown, not because she wished to be noble, but because she wanted to feel armored. If even for a breath, her sheep trusted her more than people ever had. They followed the rhythm of her voice, the sharp whistle in her teeth, the calm certainty in her posture when the wind screamed. She became their north. But on that night, the one that lingered in stories like smoke on stone, the wind did not scream. It whispered, low, hungry, wrong. The sheep clustered without command, pressed tight against her legs. The clouds hung like bruises overhead. And then, the sound, not of wind, not of man. Wolves, not one, a pack. Shadows, sliding over the rise. Eyes like coals, teeth like knives kissed by winter. Most would have fled. Most had in nights long gone, leaving flocks to scatter, letting death take what it willed. Ellsworth did not run. She stepped forward. The sheep remained behind her, silent and shivering. She reached for the fire she'd kindled in the hollow of a stone ring. The embers still lived. She took a branch, lit its tip, and lifted it high like a fallen priestess, summoning the last of the gods. Then she howled, not like a girl, not like a victim, like a beast. It was the cry of something ancient, older than bloodlines, older than kingdoms, a cry stitched from grief and bone, from orphan songs and iron frost. She screamed until her throat tore raw, and still she did not stop. She threw stones. She threw fire. The wolves hesitated. They had never met a shepherd like her. They circled, then faltered, then faded into the fog like ink into water. She remained, heart hammering like thunder, trapped in ribs, the fire dying slowly in her hand. The sheep nudged her ankles, uncertain. She fell to her knees, not in fear, but in defiance of it. When the dawn finally came, pale and trembling, the moor lay silent, but the hill remembered, and it would continue to remember. No scribe inked her name, no bard sung her tale in candlelit halls, but the wind told it. If you knew how to listen, the trees bent toward it, the stones held warmth where she'd once knelt, and some say that even now, when the wind blows from the east and the sheep grow uneasy, the grass folds slightly, as if someone stands guard still, sling in one hand, whistle in the other, because some courage does not ask for permission, it simply is. And in a world carved for kings and carved again for their sons, there are still places shaped by the forgotten, the brave, the voiceless girls, who howled when no one else would. The moor remembers, even if we forget.